Hi, I'm Heather Staines, a senior consultant for Delta Think and director of community engagement for the Open Access Data and Analytics tool. I've also had the pleasure for a number of years of being a Charleston conference director. And one of the things that I get to participate in as a result of that are these Charleston leadership interviews. Today, we're joined by Michelle Wu, and I'll kick off with asking Michelle to tell us a little bit about herself.
Sure. So my name is Michelle Wu, as you've mentioned, and I have about 25 years, a little more than 25 years in libraries. I am currently retired, but before that time, I worked primarily in academic law libraries in a variety of capacities. When I retired, I was the director of the law library at Georgetown University Law Library. And even though I say that I worked in law libraries, I should note that a lot of my experience wasn't restricted just to the law library. I almost always wore multiple hats. So at various times in my career, in addition to directing the law library, I was usually overseeing IT or finance or administration, human resources for the law school as well. So my experience is broader than just purely law libraries.
Great. Now, before we get into the details of how you got involved in librarianship, you initially thought maybe you'd be going to medical school. What happened?
Sure. So I'd say thinking of going to medical schools probably gives me a little too much credit. It was more that there was no profession that really struck me or appealed to me. So I thought medicine would be as good as any other. It was a profession that was respected by my family. So I headed down that path. If not due to two very lucky circumstances, I think I just would have continued along that path uninterrupted. But then two things did happen. The first was that I had a roommate that was interested in being a lawyer, and she was studying for the LSAT. And in helping her study, I actually found the spark that I didn't find in studying medicine. I found that the logic of law, the analytics of law, actually really appealed to me. And it made me not only think through the specific problem that was given to me, but also in my mind, I was thinking, well, what happens if you change this fact or that fact? So there's a lot about law that just appealed to me. I took the LSAT, I went to law school, and lo and behold, I found that law also, the theory of law appealed very much to me. I loved all of the analytics, all of the thought processes that went into deciding or understanding a legal issue. But the practice of law presented a problem for me, and that was that the way our legal system works is you have to have a winner and a loser. That is just the nature of how our legal system works. And the way that I problem solve, it usually isn't to say one person wins and one person loses. It's what is the best solution that we can find for these parties. And that often does not involve either party getting exactly what they want. And the legal system doesn't really allow that to happen. So the second very lucky thing that happened is that I was working in a law library while I was going through law school at the San Diego County Law Library. And I was a shelver as well as a circulation assistant. And when I was at the circulation desk, I was sitting across from the reference desk, and I got to listen to reference transactions. And that's where I discovered, this is where I can use my legal knowledge in a way that doesn't force me to say one party wins and one party loses. Everyone can win.
Just thinking about you overhearing and learning from all of those conversations at the reference desk, you mentioned it was very analog reference back in those days, and many folks who are listening to this interview may have a completely different notion of what reference is like today. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like back then and how the shifts that you saw over time?
Sure. So when I started, as you said, it was entirely analog. All the reference assistant was primarily based on print resources. I don't even think we had CDs at that time. So this was in late 1980s, early 1990s. So it was entirely print. That didn't mean that Lexis and Westlaw didn't exist. Some databases did exist, but you had to pay for someone else to search for you. Like a user could not get direct access to these databases. You actually had to pay for an intermediary to do the search for you. So primarily when you heard someone or heard the reference librarian provide assistance, it was in how to access print resources or how to find the print resources that related to the topic that the patron was asking about. Obviously, that has changed dramatically since that time. And now I think our patrons rely equally on print and database materials, just depending on what their question is. So obviously, if someone is doing historical research, there is as much or more in print and in archives than will be online. Whereas if someone is researching something like artificial intelligence, a lot of those resources will be online.
A lot of folks may know you from the work that you've done in copyright. And when we did the prep call for this interview, you said you kind of came to copyright in an unusual way through a job that you did in Houston. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So obviously, as most people who work in libraries are, we're somewhat aware of copyright. It sits on the edges, the fringes of everything that we do. And I did oversee interlibrary loan at one time, so I was more aware of copyright than I think many library staff are. But even that wasn't what triggered my interest. What triggered my interest was when I was hired by the University of Houston Law Library after Tropical Storm Allison. And Tropical Storm Allison was a storm that essentially flooded out the city of Houston, including the University of Houston Law Library. So that storm destroyed its entire collection and much of its physical facility. And I was hired after that storm to rebuild both the facility and the collection. During that process, which was very, very technical and had to comply with state and federal requirements in terms of reimbursement, I realized, you know what, there was a way that libraries could actually avoid any library having to go through this again. For any library to go through the loss of a collection, to not be able to access a collection for years after a storm, and to avoid having the expense of reacquiring a collection. And that was essentially to build a digital library. So what happened if nationally every library analyzed their collection, they all scanned in the titles that were unique to those libraries and put those up, and then we split all of the other titles among ourselves. So essentially you would build a national law library that was bigger and stronger and more complete than any one law library had. And at the same time, we would preserve everything that's unique. So the University of Houston, some of the things that it lost, it was never going to get back. Some of the things it held, no other library held it. So those are now completely lost to history. So this was a way to build a collection for preservation, for society, for our generation, for future generations, that avoided all the hassle or all the problems that I saw had been caused by Tropical Storm Allison. So that's when I started getting into this idea of what is a better way to build a collection. And the only way to build a digital collection was to tackle the question of copyright, right? Because in order to create a digital collection, you actually have to scan in materials, which is making a copy of something. And that was pretty much my trigger to dive deep into the copyright issues and to come up with a legal theory, which today is known in a narrower form as controlled digital lending, or CDL. But it essentially said, okay, if a library acquires a copy of a work, they can digitize it and use the digital copy in place of the print copy. As long as they never use more copies than what they legitimately acquired, that is within the spirit of copyright. So that launched my interest in exploring how copyright can be used to help libraries.
I want to talk a little bit more about that controlled digital lending, and particularly the spotlight that COVID shined on that as a possibility. But before that, you had told me that when you initially came up with this idea around digitization, the technology just wasn't really there. It wasn't going to be cost effective. Can you tell a little bit about how that kind of foundational change needed to happen before really CDL could get some traction?
Yeah, so I came up with this idea around I want to say 2001, 2002. So if you remember that in terms of the history of digitization, this was before Google Books. So it was really when digitization was not all that popular. So when I came up with the idea, I started talking to library service providers as well as librarians about it. People were very interested. They thought it made a lot of sense, like logical sense, it made sense. But it was too expensive to do. There were no systems, you would have to build a platform. You would have to acquire the equipment. It was just something that was out of reach, largely not because people wanted to do it, but because the technology was too expensive. Just 10 years later, I can't believe it was just that short of a time period. Just 10 years later, digitization equipment was pretty common. It was still expensive, but it was much less expensive than it was before. And you had programs everywhere, including in libraries, who actually could create platforms if they wanted to. So when I started at Georgetown University, we were lucky in that several years in, we hired someone named Leah Prescott, who had a history in digitization. She ran our digital initiatives and special collections for us. And she had, in one of her former jobs, worked for the Getty. And the Getty at that time had partnered with the Internet Archive on several digitization projects. And it was through that knowledge that Leah was aware of something that they called Open Library. And Open Library was essentially what is known now today as CDL, but it took it out of the theory of my writing and my talking about it into a practical application. So we actually saw a platform that could do what I had described. And so Leah made the introduction she introduced IA to me and me to IA.
Great. So 2001, 2002, idea is born, technology just not very accessible. 10 years later, technology more accessible. And almost another 10 years later, the COVID-19 pandemic closes effectively libraries, almost completely in some places. And that really brought some additional attention to controlled digital lending. So how did the conversation shift as a result of necessity with the pandemic?
Sure. So I would say probably about the 4 years before the pandemic, I and some colleagues, we were speaking at just about every library conference about controlled digital lending. So it was very well known. And most libraries believed, oh yes, this is a fair use. This makes perfect sense. However, there was still a risk with engaging in activity, even if you think it's fair use, right? That what they learned from the Hadi Trust case was you could be engaging in fair use. The courts could decide in your favor, and you will still be left with this gigantic legal bill, having had to defend your actions as fair use. So you can win, but all of this money would still have to be spent that you could spend better on staff or collections. So the risk wasn't enough to make libraries to make the switch to CDL until, as you say, the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, the entire risk analysis changed. If they didn't engage in CDL, they couldn't make any of their collections available to their users. And then what value is there in those collections if you can't actually have your users access them? So all of a sudden, there was interest, not just in the concept of CDL, but okay, how do we do this? And when I say there was interest, it wasn't just interest from libraries. There was interest in library service providers. There was interest in ILS vendors, people who sold digitization equipment. So there was interest all across the entire spectrum in terms of how do we get information to our users?
Yeah, it's incredible how, different factors can come together and really shift thinking. I'm really struck by the notion that your first task way back in Houston was the disaster recovery. And I think we see what happens to collections across the United States, across the world, whether it's slow climate change causing buildings to sink, or earthquakes causing buildings to collapse, or fires. There's lots of things. And I could see in one, respect, your mind going to, strengthening and hardening the physical building there, but you went in another direction. And I think that's a testament to one of the things that you told me is one you consider to be one of your greatest strengths, which is strategy. So you thought, well, let's think longer term, let's think outside the box, let's not just move everything up to a higher level. So when you think about the role that your strategic mind, has played across your career, how do you see it having an effect at different points?
Sure. I mean, I think that it helped in terms of it moves the conversation forward, even with CDL, despite the fact that we spent years, decades on this before we actually saw really major movement. It helps to have people just strategizing in terms of what helps us not just today, but helps us going forward. What helps us in multiple situations, not just in case of a flood, but in case of a fire. What happens in the case of a pandemic? Granted, I did not foresee a pandemic coming, but just coming up with ideas on how do we best protect our access to information? How do we best protect our history? I think having those conversations makes it more possible for everyone engaged in the library field to be better prepared to act when it becomes necessary to act. So even though I do wish that we had adopted in large scale CDL prior to the pandemic, the fact that it was already in place and that those discussions had already taken place, I think it made it easier for libraries to pivot to that after the pandemic, to talk to their councils about it and say, listen, this actually has been discussed. There is literature on it. So to give people tools to move forward, even if they don't move forward immediately.
Great. Now you have you were just off of speaking at the Charleston conference. We're recording this in December of 2023. You've been to Charleston a couple times. You've spoken twice. Maybe give us some of your impressions about the event, about the people that you went there, what it was like to be a speaker.
It is I think it's a very both rich and unusual conference, at least from my experience. And part of that may have to do with the size, or it may have to do with the participants. But the two things that I think I've noticed the most is it is the conference where I most frequently will leave a program and hear all the participants still talking about the topic, that they're exploring it in even greater depth than the speakers were. They're taking it in different tangents. There's a lot of creativity and exploration and true engagement. And I'm not sure if that level of engagement has to do with the characteristics of the people that come to Charleston. What I've noticed is I encounter actually a lot of people at Charleston who have worn multiple hats. They haven't stayed in one particular, like they'll have worked in different types of libraries, not just a specific specialization. They'll have worked both in a library as a librarian and for a publisher. So they just have different perspectives, and I think that makes the conversation richer.
Right. Now, you mentioned that you recently retired. So what are you really devoting the bulk of your time to these days, other than obviously coming to Charleston and talking for the long arm session?
Sure. So I put in my resignation over a year before the pandemic began. And obviously, since that time, a lot has changed. So at the time that I retired, I thought I was going to spend my time on something that I was calling philanthropic innovation, which was the creation of apps and platforms that were designed for social good, that were not driven by the idea of profit. However, with the pandemic and the rise of CDL, as well with a lot of political movements like the legislatures proposing laws to sue librarians for lending books, book bans, the restrictions on gender affirming care, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, I did not go down the path of philanthropic innovation and instead started strategizing, okay, how can we get back our civil liberties? How can we protect the things that I actually thought were more safe than they actually were when I retired? So I've been spending a lot of time, I think, both talking and writing on CDL, so things dealing with libraries, as well as those general larger civil liberty issues.
Obviously, very important stuff, and some of the other topics at the recent conference. Now, you are a firm believer in mentorship, I guess, both for folks who are new to the profession, but also those who are thinking about whether they want to, shift their path within it. Could you talk a little bit about how your own thought process worked in that regard and the advice that you give to others?
In terms of mentorship, I really try to emphasize or ask people to consider, do they know themselves? Do they know what moves them? What brings them satisfaction in their job? And the reason I emphasize that over other things such as title or status is because I think that there is actually, we talk a lot about the tangible benefits. We talk a lot about the job description. We talk about the title, the status, the pay, the benefits. But I think what we don't pay a lot of attention to when we decide where our career is going is, what is going to make me satisfied in this job? Because there's a lot in that goes beyond just what you're being paid or what your benefits are or the job description. It has to do with the people that you're working with. It has to do with what you enjoy doing. I know a number of library directors that went to a library directorship because they thought that was what they were supposed to do. And then they realized afterwards that they just hated the politics that go hand in hand with being a director. And if people can realize that, can think about those questions prior to taking a job, I actually think they'll be happier in their jobs. And when you're happier, you're just more productive. So my biggest point in mentorship is spend your time thinking about the intangibles of a job. Spend as much time thinking about yourself. Who is your character? How it ties into this job, and where you're going, as much as you do about all the tangible pieces that you can point to, like pay or title or status.
Yeah, and one more question along these lines. You were fortunate. You told me that the managers you reported to often let you kind of work outside. You were never constrained by a job description, you said, and so you got to try a lot of different things. And so, you just talked about folks who are thinking about their pathway. What advice would you give to managers who are trying to bring up our next generation within the profession, and just so that they can grow outside of their job descriptions?
Sure. I think my advice is never assume that we know better. Just because you have more experience in a field or in a particular job, even if you've trained 100, 200 librarians, it doesn't mean that we know everything. So pay attention to what you hear from everyone who works for you. Try to give them a chance to change things, even if you think it's going to fail. Like, even if you think it's going to fail, let them try, because we learn from failure as well, right? And something that may have failed 10 years ago could actually succeed now with a different configuration or because it's a different time. So provide support in allowing people to try things. As long as you can serve as a safety net as well, right? You don't want people to stumble into a mistake that you can see 10 miles away, but you can guide them. And that's probably the best thing that you can do, is give them free rein to try to meet a goal. If you can see what they're trying to do, that they are actually trying to be helpful, that they're being thoughtful, help them by supporting them in that exploration, in that attempt to make things better, to improve things, or to provide a service that you're not providing already.
Thank you. That's wonderful advice to live by. It's been a pleasure talking to you here today. Thank you for participating and attending the Charleston conference. The event is definitely better for having you be a part of it, and I hope to cross paths with you again at a future event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a joy to be at Charleston and to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks.